Nina Blackwell stood in front of the large mirror in the luxurious hotel suite, looking at herself in the white wedding dress. Her hands trembled, her mind still in disbelief. How had she gotten here? She had never imagined herself in this position, standing at the altar of an extravagant wedding, not because of love, but because of an unexpected set of circumstances. Her family's financial troubles had led to this moment. After months of managing a failing business, Nina's parents had struck an agreement with Dominic Thorne, the billionaire CEO of a rival company, to save the family business from bankruptcy. The solution? Nina would marry him, a man she had barely met. It was a business arrangement, a transaction to protect her family's legacy, not a romance. The wedding was no longer about Nina or Dominic, but about survival. She had been thrust into the role of the obedient daughter who would sacrifice her happiness for the good of the family. No questions asked, no chance to say no. The ceremony proceeded with sterile precision. Everything was perfect. The lavish venue, the expensive decorations, the well-dressed guests. But Nina couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider in her own wedding. Every word spoken was formal. Every smile exchanged polite but empty. There was no warmth in the air, no sense of excitement or love. This was just another business deal wrapped in a beautiful white dress. Dominic stood at the altar, his cold eyes scanning the room, not meeting hers. Tall and impeccably groomed in a black tuxedo, he was the picture of business acumen and power. He wasn't here because he wanted her. He was here because his company needed this marriage. His future depended on it. When Nina finally walked down the aisle, her heart felt heavy, the weight of the situation almost unbearable. She couldn't even bring herself to look at him. This was a union of convenience, not love. And though the world seemed to applaud their union, the silence between them was deafening. Later that night, after the wedding, Nina found herself sitting alone in their grand bedroom. She was surrounded by luxury, but it all felt empty. The bed felt cold, the silence oppressive. Dominic had left for a meeting shortly after the ceremony, leaving her to stare at the ornate surroundings that felt more like a gilded cage than a home. She had never imagined her life would lead her here. She had always been the kind of person who valued independence, who thought she could build her own future. But now, here she was, trapped in a marriage she didn't want, with a man she didn't know. The next morning, she woke up to a house that was too quiet. She looked over at the empty side of the bed where Dominic had slept, but he was already gone, probably off to handle another company issue. Nina didn't know much about him beyond his business dealings. He was a powerful figure in the tech world, and now she was his wife, a title that seemed to have no meaning. A week later, Nina found herself in his office, sitting across from him during one of their many business meetings. Dominic had been distant and formal since their wedding, and their conversations were mostly about company matters. He was polite, but cold, and it made Nina feel like she was just another one of his employees. The tension in the room was palpable, but Nina tried to focus on the task at hand. Her parents had forced her to accept this arrangement, but she was determined to not lose herself in it. She had to find a way to make this work, for the sake of her family, but also for herself. Dominic looked up from his laptop and gave her a curt nod, signaling that the meeting was over. "Is there anything else?" he asked, his tone businesslike, though his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. Nina hesitated, then nodded, standing up to leave. "No, that's all for today." As she turned to leave, Dominic's voice stopped her. "Wait," he said. "Are you okay with this?" I know we've barely spoken since the wedding, but if you ever need to talk. His voice trailed off, but there was something in his eyes, something softer that caught Nina off guard. Nina looked at him for a long moment, unsure of what to say. She wasn't ready to open up to him, not when everything between them felt so transactional. But for some reason, his words lingered in her mind long after she left the office. That evening, Nina sat in the quiet of her apartment, staring out the window at the lights of the city below. She had always believed in the power of hard work, of building something from the ground up. But now she realized she had no idea how to build a life from this, a life where she felt like she was truly seen and valued. Dominic hadn't made any effort to get to know her since their wedding. And yet there were moments, small glimmers, when his gaze softened, when his voice wasn't so cold. She wasn't sure what to make of it. Was he being kind out of obligation? Or was there something else? Nina had a long road ahead of her. This marriage wasn't her choice, and the uncertainty of it all weighed on her every day. She didn't know what she expected from Dominic, but part of her wanted to believe that there was more to this than just a business transaction. But for now, all she could do was take things one day at a time. The days after the wedding had been a blur. Nina found herself adjusting to a life that seemed foreign, not just because she was now married to a stranger, but because she felt like she had been thrown into a world where she didn't belong. The house was a mansion, far too grand for her simple tastes. The staff was courteous, but distant, and every room in the house was pristine, devoid of any personal touch. It felt more like a show than a home. Dominic had been out of town for business most of the week, leaving Nina to navigate her new life alone. Her days were filled with long hours spent in the office, trying to learn the ropes of the company she was now unofficially part of, and the evenings spent alone, wandering the massive house, trying to find some semblance of comfort. One afternoon, Nina sat in her office at Dominic's company, reviewing a set of documents. She was trying to focus, but her mind kept drifting. The pressure of the situation weighed on her. Her parents had all but forced her into this marriage, and while Dominic hadn't been unkind, there was an emotional distance between them that she couldn't ignore. She couldn't shake the feeling that, despite their shared life, they were still two strangers living in parallel worlds. Just as she was about to lose herself in her thoughts, the door to her office opened. She looked up, startled to see Dominic standing in the doorway. He hadn't been home in the past few days, and his presence, though not unfamiliar, still made her feel uneasy. "I need your help with something," Dominic said, his voice calm but carrying an air of authority that made her heart race. Nina nodded, still unsure of how to act around him. "Sure, what do you need?" He stepped into the office and closed the door behind him. "I've been thinking about some changes in the company, and I want you to help me prepare for a meeting with potential investors next week." Nina raised an eyebrow. "Me, are you sure? I'm still learning the ropes here." Dominic gave her a sharp look, his expression unreadable. "You're more capable than you give yourself credit for, Nina. I've been watching your work. You've got potential." His words caught her off guard. She hadn't expected to receive praise from him, especially not after everything that had happened. She had assumed he saw her as just another part of his business arrangement, nothing more than a pawn in his carefully calculated life. But now, hearing him speak to her like this, made her realize something. Maybe he didn't see her as just a wife in name. Maybe he was starting to see her for who she truly was. "I'll help," she said, her voice more confident than she felt. Let's make sure the presentation is perfect. Dominic nodded, a small flicker of something in his eyes. Maybe approval, maybe something else, before he turned to leave. Good. I'll see you in the conference room at 4 p.m. The following week was a whirlwind of meetings, spreadsheets, and preparations for the investor pitch. Nina and Dominic worked side by side in the office, and while the professional distance between them was still there, it felt less suffocating. Dominic had stopped giving her orders and started asking for her opinions about the company, the market, and even personal matters, though still just the surface-level kind. As the day of the meeting drew closer, Nina began to feel a strange sense of pride. This was her first real project with the company, and she felt like she was actually making a difference. Dominic's approval, though rare, was a driving force for her. She had always prided herself on being independent and capable, and now it seemed like he was beginning to see her that way too. The night before the big presentation, after a long day of finalizing details, Dominic asked Nina to join him for dinner at a nearby restaurant. He didn't mention business, didn't talk about the pitch, and didn't even mention their marriage. It was as if they were just two people having dinner together. The restaurant was quiet, elegant, with soft lighting and a relaxed ambience that allowed Nina to finally breathe. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed simple, human interaction until now. Dominic didn't talk much, but his questions were different from before. Instead of talking about business, he asked about her life, her childhood, her dreams, her thoughts on the future. It was the first time he had ever shown any genuine curiosity about her as a person, and it made Nina wonder if he saw her as more than just a wife, more than just a business partner. For the first time, she let her guard down, talking freely about her life before she'd been thrust into this marriage. Dominic listened intently, and for the first time, she saw a softness in his eyes, a hint of the man he used to be before everything became about the business. The next day, the meeting with investors went well. Nina felt a rush of adrenaline as the presentation unfolded, and she could see the surprise in Dominic's eyes as she confidently presented her ideas. The investors were impressed, and Dominic looked at her with something that wasn't just business approval. It was a recognition of her intelligence, her capability. After the meeting, as they walked out of the conference room, Dominic turned to her, his usual cool demeanor back in place. But there was something new in his voice when he spoke. "You did well today." Nina felt a flush of pride, and for the first time in weeks, she realized something. This partnership, this unexpected marriage, wasn't just a burden anymore. It wasn't just a business deal. It was something more. The weeks following the successful presentation passed in a blur of business deals, client meetings, and long hours at the office. Nina found herself settling into a rhythm, her role at the company becoming more defined. She was no longer just the wife of the CEO. She was a valued member of the team, contributing ideas and leading initiatives. Dominic, though still distant, had begun to give her more responsibility, which, in a way, made her feel like she was starting to carve out her own place in this world. But despite their professional success, the gap between them remained. Dominic's demeanor hadn't changed much. He was still cool, reserved, and distant, always the CEO first and the man second. Nina had learned to respect his boundaries, but there was a nagging feeling that she was still just a part of the deal. A wife, a business partner, but never really anything else. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings, Nina found herself in the company's private lounge, finishing up some paperwork. She was about to leave when she saw Dominic enter the room. His expression was as unreadable as ever, but tonight there was something different in the way he held himself. "Long day?" Nina asked casually, looking up from the papers in front of her. Dominic hesitated for a moment before sitting across from her. "Yeah," he said, his voice more strained than usual. "I've been dealing with some issues with the board. It's never easy." Nina nodded, her gaze meeting his for a moment. "I can imagine. Is everything okay?" He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, the weight of his thoughts clearly pressing on him. "It's just, sometimes I feel like I'm carrying everything on my own. The company, the legacy, the expectations. And I can't help but feel like I'm losing touch with everything that matters." His words caught Nina off guard. She had never heard him speak so openly about his struggles. Dominic Thorne, the man who seemed untouchable, was now revealing cracks in his armor. There was a vulnerability in his voice that she wasn't used to hearing. "That sounds overwhelming," Nina said softly. "But you don't have to do it alone, you know. You've got a team behind you, and you've got me. We're in this together." Dominic looked at her, his piercing eyes softer than usual. "I know, but sometimes it feels like I'm stuck in a cycle, always fighting for control. And I don't know if it's worth it anymore." There was a long silence between them as Nina processed his words. For the first time, she saw Dominic as more than just a businessman. He was a person, a man burdened by his own expectations, and the pressure of maintaining an empire. "You've built something incredible," Nina said quietly. "But you don't have to sacrifice everything for it. You don't have to lose yourself in the process." Dominic looked at her, and for a fleeting moment, she saw something in his eyes. Gratitude. Regret. It was hard to tell. But for the first time, it felt like they were sharing something real. The following week, things at work became more intense. Nina found herself working closely with Dominic on a new project that would significantly impact the company's future. They spent long hours together in meetings and brainstorming sessions. And during these moments, Nina began to see a different side of him. Dominic was no longer just the aloof CEO. He was a driven, passionate leader who cared deeply about his company, and it was clear that Nina was starting to gain his respect, both professionally and personally. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Dominic invited Nina to join him for a late dinner at the company's private restaurant. Nina hesitated for a moment before agreeing. The thought of spending time alone with him, outside of work, was a bit daunting. But something told her this was important. Dinner was simple but elegant, the atmosphere calm and private, away from the distractions of the office. They sat across from each other, the candlelight casting soft shadows on their faces. For the first time in a long while, Nina felt a sense of ease between them. "So," Dominic said, breaking the silence, "what do you think about the direction the company is heading? You've been here long enough now to see where we're going." Nina took a moment to gather her thoughts. "Honestly, I think you're on the right track, but there's room for growth. Your team is strong, but I think there's a lot more potential you could tap into, especially with the upcoming merger. If you focus more on innovation, not just in terms of products, but in company culture, you'll see long-term success." Dominic listened intently, his eyes never leaving hers. "I like your approach," he said. "You don't just see things on the surface. You get to the core of the problem. That's rare." Nina smiled, feeling the weight of his words. "Well, I've always been one to look deeper. Surface-level solutions don't work in the long run." For a moment, There was a comfortable silence between them, and Nina felt like they were not just two people caught in an unexpected marriage, but two professionals working toward a common goal. Later that night, as Nina was heading home, she found herself thinking about their dinner. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was just a part of a business transaction. She was part of something bigger, something meaningful. Dominic, despite his flaws and his cold exterior, was beginning to open up, not just to her as his wife, but to her as a partner. A sense of mutual respect was growing between them, and it was hard to ignore the way she felt when they were together. There was something more to their connection, something that went beyond the business and the obligations of their marriage. As she walked into her apartment, she stopped by the window, looking out at the city lights. She had no idea what the future held, whether this relationship would stay strictly professional or evolve into something more. But one thing was clear: things were changing, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what might come next. The days following their dinner were a mix of progress and confusion. On one hand, Nina and Dominic had made significant strides professionally. The merger was moving ahead smoothly, and Nina was finally starting to feel like an integral part of the team, not just the wife of the CEO. On the other hand, the lines between business and personal began to blur in ways that neither of them had anticipated. One morning, as they sat in the conference room discussing the next phase of the company's expansion, Nina found herself noticing Dominic in a way she hadn't before. He was focused, confident, and sharp as ever. But today, there was something more in his demeanor. He seemed more relaxed, more willing to listen to her ideas without the usual air of detachment he often carried. "You've done a great job on this, Nina," Dominic said, looking at her directly. His words weren't just professional praise. There was something else in his tone. "I'm impressed with the direction you've taken this project." Nina blinked in surprise. She was used to his business-like compliments, but this felt different. "Thanks," she replied, a slight flush creeping into her cheeks. She quickly looked down at the notes in front of her to hide her reaction. Dominic didn't seem to notice, though. He was already moving on to the next point in the agenda. But Nina couldn't shake the feeling that things between them were shifting. Their conversations had gone from cold, distant exchanges to something more collaborative. There was an ease to their interactions that hadn't been there before. Later that afternoon, Nina was in her office when she received a message from Dominic. "I need you in my office in 10 minutes. There's something we need to discuss." Nina furrowed her brow as she read the message. There was a sense of urgency in his tone that wasn't typical. She quickly gathered her things and made her way to his office, her mind racing with possibilities. When she entered, Dominic was standing by the window, looking out over the city. He turned as she walked in, his expression unreadable as usual, but his posture was tense. "What's going on?" Nina asked, trying to keep her voice calm, though she couldn't hide the curiosity in her eyes. Dominic took a deep breath before speaking. "I've been thinking a lot about the future of the company and where we're heading. There's been some pressure from the board, and I'm starting to feel like I can't keep up with all the demands. Not just the company, everything. It's exhausting." Nina didn't expect him to be so open. She had always seen him as someone who kept his emotions locked away, but today he seemed different. There was vulnerability in his words that surprised her. "I get it," she said, her voice softening. "You've been under a lot of stress. But you don't have to handle everything on your own. You have a team for a reason." Dominic turned to face her fully now, his eyes meeting hers. I don't know if I've ever really let anyone in, Nina. I've been carrying all this weight for so long, and I'm starting to wonder if it's all worth it. The raw honesty in his voice caught Nina off guard. She had never seen him like this before. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. The powerful CEO who ran the company with ironclad control was standing in front of her, vulnerable and uncertain. You don't have to do this alone, Nina said quietly. We're in this together. The company, everything. You don't have to carry the burden by yourself. Dominic was silent for a moment, and Nina could almost hear the wheels turning in his head. Finally, he nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Thanks, he said, his voice quieter than usual. I think I needed to hear that. Over the next few days, things between them began to change. Dominic was still the CEO, still the powerful figure who ran everything with precision. But now, there was a new dynamic between them. They were no longer just business partners. There was a sense of shared understanding, a subtle connection that Nina couldn't ignore. They spent more time together, not just in the office, but also outside of work. Dominic invited her to dinner once or twice, and their conversations shifted from strictly business to more personal topics. They talked about their childhoods, their fears, and even their dreams for the future. One night, after a particularly long day, Dominic asked Nina to meet him at the company's private restaurant for a late dinner. She agreed, though she couldn't help but wonder what had prompted him to ask Dot. At dinner, the mood was relaxed. The restaurant was quiet, intimate, and the food was exquisite. They started the meal in silence, but soon Dominic began to speak, his voice surprisingly casual. Do you ever feel like you're trapped in your own life? He asked, his eyes meeting hers across the table. Nina raised an eyebrow, taken aback by the question. What do you mean? I don't know, he said, shrugging. Like, you're doing everything you're supposed to do, but something's missing. Like you're stuck in a role you never asked for, and you don't know how to get out. Nina paused, reflecting on his words. She had felt that way more than once, especially since her marriage to Dominic. She had gone along with everything, but she wasn't sure who she was anymore, or what she truly wanted. I know exactly what you mean, she said quietly. Sometimes I feel like I'm just going through the motions, like I'm not living the life I imagined for myself. Dominic looked at her, his gaze softening. I think we've both been living that way, doing what we're supposed to do, but not really living. Maybe it's time for a change, for the first time in a long time. Nina felt like Dominic wasn't just a CEO, a powerful figure in her life. He was someone who understood her, someone who had his own struggles, just like she did. The evening ended quietly, but Nina couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting between them. They weren't just two people stuck in an arranged marriage anymore. They were becoming something more, something real, something worth exploring. As she returned home that night, she found herself thinking about Dominic more than usual. She had spent so long keeping her emotions in check, but now she couldn't deny the growing connection between them. She wasn't sure where it would lead, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid to find out. It had been weeks since their dinner at the private restaurant, and Nina couldn't stop thinking about it. She had expected things to go back to normal after that night, but they didn't. The air between her and Dominic felt different, thicker, more charged. It wasn't just the business discussions that had changed. There was an underlying tension, a new level of familiarity that neither of them had openly acknowledged, but both could feel. Dominic still maintained his distance, as was his nature. He had always kept his emotions locked away behind that CEO facade. And while there were moments when he seemed to let his guard down, they were fleeting. Nina, however, couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts, the softer tone in his voice, the brief moments when his eyes lingered on her just a second longer than necessary. It was as though the walls between them were crumbling, piece by piece. But neither was quite ready to admit it. It was a Thursday afternoon when the next shift came. They were sitting in the company's conference room, discussing plans for a major product launch. Nina had been fully immersed in the project, leading a team of engineers and designers, working long hours to get everything perfect. Dominic had been there too, more involved than usual, and for the first time, Nina found herself enjoying their collaborations. There was a certain synergy between them, an unspoken understanding that made the work feel more like a partnership than a transaction. As the meeting came to a close, Dominic gave her an approving glance, his eyes holding hers for a brief but telling moment. "Good work," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "This project wouldn't be where it is without you." Nina smiled, feeling a rush of pride. "Thanks. It's been a team effort. You've been a great leader through this," he said, his voice softer now, almost like he was speaking to her as a peer. Not just the wife of the CEO. For the first time, she felt like he truly saw her. Not as his wife, not as a business obligation, but as someone capable of more. She had always known her worth, but hearing it from him, especially after everything they had been through, felt different. "Dominic." She started, but stopped herself. She had nearly said something she wasn't sure she was ready to voice. There was a question on the tip of her tongue, but she couldn't bring herself to ask it. Later that evening, as Nina was heading home, she received a text from Dominic. It was a simple message. "Can we talk? I'll be home in an hour." Her heart skipped a beat. She had no idea what this conversation would be about, but something told her that it was going to be important. At home, the house was quiet, and for the first time in a while, Nina found herself nervous. She had been through so much since their marriage began, the tension, the uncertainty, the unspoken emotions. But lately, there had been something different between them. She wasn't sure what it was, but she knew it was something worth exploring. Dominic was already sitting in the living room when she walked in. His usual confident posture slightly slouched as he stared into the fireplace. He looked up when she entered, his expression unreadable, though there was a faint trace of something softer in his eyes. "Sit down," he said, motioning to the space next to him on the couch. His tone was calm, but there was a weight to it that made Nina's stomach flutter. Nina hesitated, but then took a seat beside him. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. "I've been thinking about a lot of things," Dominic began, his voice quieter than usual. "About the company, about the future, and about us." The way he said us made Nina's heart skip. She had no idea what to expect from this conversation, but she knew it wasn't just about business. "I know we've never really discussed what this marriage means, beyond the company and everything we've been working on, but I think it's time we start thinking about it, start acknowledging it for what it is, not just what it was supposed to be." Nina looked at him, her breath catching. She didn't know what he meant by that, but something told her that this was the turning point, the point where things could either stay the same or shift into something else entirely. "Dominic, She began, but she didn't know how to finish the sentence. She had so many questions, so many things she wanted to say, but the fear of what it might mean for their future held her back. Dominic turned toward her, his gaze intense. "I'm not asking you to have all the answers, but I need to know." Where do we go from here? The question hung in the air, and for the first time in their marriage, Nina didn't feel the pressure of obligation. There was no business arrangement here, no expectation that she would just go along with what Dominic decided. This was a real conversation, one that asked her to think about the future, not just as his wife, but as herself. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice soft but honest. "I don't know where we go from here. But I do know that I can't keep pretending like everything's fine when it isn't." Dominic didn't respond immediately. He just sat there, looking at her, his expression unreadable. But after a long silence, he spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "We don't have to pretend," he said, his words heavy with sincerity. "I don't want to pretend anymore, Nina, not with you." The vulnerability in his voice took Nina by surprise. She had always seen Dominic as a man of strength, of control, someone who didn't show his emotions. But now, she was seeing a side of him that had always been hidden beneath the surface. It was raw and it was real. "I'm not sure what this means yet," she said, "but I know I want to try. I want to see where this goes. Not just as a business arrangement, but as us." Dominic nodded, a slow, almost imperceptible smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time since their marriage began, Nina felt like they were on the same page, like they were both ready to face what was next. The days following their conversation were marked by a new sense of uncertainty. Nina and Dominic had made a breakthrough, but they both knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There was still a lot left unsaid, and the tension between them, though softened, lingered in the air. The more they worked together, the more they realized that their connection had started to go beyond the boundaries of just business. They were beginning to trust each other more, to lean on each other for support in ways they hadn't before. But with that new level of closeness came new questions, questions that neither of them had answers to yet. It was a Friday afternoon, and Nina was sitting in her office, reviewing a set of financial projections for an upcoming venture. The company was on the brink of a major expansion, and Nina felt the pressure mounting. But today, her mind kept drifting back to Dominic. She hadn't seen him much in the past few days. He'd been caught up in meetings and late-night work sessions, as usual, and their conversations had been brief. But when he walked into her office unannounced that afternoon, the tension in the air shifted. "Nina," Dominic said, his voice calm, but there was an underlying seriousness to it. "I need to talk to you about something. Can you come to my office?" Nina looked up, her heart skipping a beat. There was something in his tone, a weight to it that made her wonder if this conversation would be different from the others they had shared. "Of course," she said, gathering her papers and standing up in Dominic's office. The mood was more somber than usual. The room, with its sleek, minimalist design, felt colder somehow, as if it was reflecting the distance that had crept back into their dynamic over the past few days. Dominic was standing by the window, looking out at the city below. "You look like you have something on your mind," Nina said, her voice tentative. Dominic turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I do," he admitted, his eyes meeting hers. "It's about us." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Nina wasn't sure what to say. Had they made too much progress, too quickly? Was Dominic pulling back again? "We've been getting closer," he continued, his tone heavy. "And I think it's time we talked about where this is going." Nina swallowed hard. "Where do you think it's going?" Dominic stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I don't know." But I know that I don't want to keep pretending like nothing is happening between us. I don't want to keep running from this." Nina's heart raced. For so long, she had kept her guard up, never allowing herself to truly consider what a deeper relationship with Dominic might mean. Now, standing in front of him, hearing him say that, she felt the walls she had built around herself start to crack. "I don't know what to say," Nina whispered. "I've been so focused on keeping my distance, protecting myself, ... But now I'm not sure what to do." Dominic's expression softened, and for the first time in a while, Nina saw the man behind the CEO, the one who had been so guarded, so controlled. He was vulnerable now, and it made her feel exposed in ways she hadn't anticipated. "I know you're scared," Dominic said quietly. "I am too. But we can't keep pretending like we don't care. I don't want to go on like this, Nina. I want to try, even if it's difficult. Even if we don't have all the answers." Nina's eyes filled with emotion. She had never imagined that she would be in this situation, standing here with Dominic, trying to figure out what came next. But now that the question had been asked, she realized that she couldn't keep pretending she didn't feel the same way. She couldn't keep denying the growing connection between them. "Okay," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared too, but I want to try to." Dominic's face softened, and a small smile played at the corners of his lips. "We'll figure it out, Nina, together." The following week, they both began to take small steps toward what felt like a new chapter in their lives. They still had moments of tension, still had their doubts, but there was also a new sense of understanding between them. It was as if they had finally acknowledged the elephant in the room, and though it was uncomfortable, it was also freeing. But as they worked through their evolving relationship, the past, the shadows that both Nina and Dominic had been trying to outrun, began to surface. One evening, as they were working late in Dominic's office, Nina glanced at him across the conference table. She noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his jaw. She knew he was thinking about something that had been eating away at him for a while. "Dominic," she said quietly, her voice soft yet insistent. "What is it? You've been quiet all night." He looked up at her, his eyes shadowed with something dark. "I don't want to talk about it," he said, his voice hoarse. "Not yet," but Nina didn't let it go. She had learned enough about him over the past few weeks to know that when he was like this, it was because he was hiding something. "You've been carrying something for a long time," she said gently. "You don't have to keep it to yourself anymore. If we're going to do this, if we're going to try, we have to be honest with each other." Dominic stared at her for a long moment, and then, finally, his shoulders slumped. He let out a deep breath, the weight of his own emotions clearly pressing down on him. "I've never really let anyone in, Nina," he said, his voice tight. "Not since I lost my father. I've kept everything inside, thinking I could handle it on my own. But the truth is, I don't know if I'm doing the right thing anymore. I don't know if I can keep running the company this way. If I keep holding on to this control, I'm going to lose everything that matters." Nina could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the rawness of his confession. She reached across the table, placing her hand on his. "You don't have to do it alone," she said softly. "You have me, Dominic, and we'll figure it out together." The days after their conversation about Dominic's past were filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Dominic had opened up to Nina in a way he had never done before, and that shift in their dynamic gave her a sense of optimism. She had seen the vulnerability in his eyes, the weight he had been carrying all this time, and it made her feel closer to him than ever. But as much as they were beginning to find their footing, the past was never far behind. For all the progress they had made in their relationship, there were still deep scars, personal and professional, that neither of them had fully confronted. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and Nina was in her office, going over the final details for an upcoming presentation. The company was on the verge of a major deal with a group of investors, and she was feeling the pressure. This was one of the biggest opportunities for the company, and she was determined to make it work. But as she reviewed the numbers, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Dominic. "We need to talk. Can you meet me in my office?" Nina frowned, her stomach twisting in knots. Dominic hadn't asked to meet her like this in days. She couldn't help but wonder if something was wrong. She quickly grabbed her things and made her way to his office, her mind racing with possibilities. When she arrived, Dominic was sitting at his desk, his back to the door as he stared at the computer screen. There was a heaviness in the air, and Nina could feel it immediately. This wasn't the same light conversation they'd had the last time they were together. Something was different. "Dominic," she said softly, knocking lightly on the doorframe. "You wanted to talk?" Dominic looked up, his face shadowed with concern. For a moment, there was silence. He didn't ask her to sit, didn't offer any pleasantries. He just gestured for her to come closer. "I've been going over the merger documents," Dominic said, his voice low and strained. "And there's something I didn't see before. We've been so focused on the business side of things that we've overlooked a major risk." Nina raised an eyebrow, her pulse quickening. "What kind of risk?" Dominic ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. "The investors we've been working with, they're not as trustworthy as we thought. They've been hiding things, pushing for more control in ways that could compromise the entire deal. If we move forward with this, it could ruin everything we've worked for." Nina's heart sank. She had known the business world was full of risks, but she hadn't expected it to come to this. The timing couldn't have been worse. The deal had been poised to take the company to the next level, and now it was in jeopardy. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the growing anxiety in her chest. "I don't know yet," Dominic replied, his voice tight. "I've been considering pulling out, but that could damage the company's reputation. I need your help, Nina. You know this market better than anyone." The next few days were a blur of meetings, calls, and late-night strategizing. Dominic and Nina worked tirelessly to assess their options, trying to find a way to salvage the deal without compromising their values or the company's future. The tension between them was palpable, both professionally and personally. The closer they got to the truth about the investors, the more it seemed like their carefully constructed world was falling apart. And through all of this, Nina couldn't help but notice the distance growing between them. Dominic had been more withdrawn, consumed by the stress of the situation, and she felt the weight of his silence. It wasn't the same as before, when they barely spoke. Now it was like he was shutting her out. One evening, after another long day of work, Nina decided to confront him. She couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. They needed to talk, not just about the merger, but about where they stood with each other. She knocked on the door to his office, not waiting for an invitation before walking in. "Dominic, we need to talk," she said, her voice firm. Dominic looked up from his desk, his tired eyes meeting hers. "What about?" "About us," she replied, her heart racing. "We can't keep ignoring the fact that something has changed between us." The tension, the distance, it's affecting everything. We can't let this business deal ruin what we've started. And I can't keep pretending like everything is fine when you're pulling away. Dominic sighed, running a hand over his face. Nina, I don't know what you want from me. I've been under so much pressure, trying to keep everything from falling apart. This company, this marriage, it's all weighing on me. I don't know how to handle it all. Nina took a step forward, her voice softer now. I get it, Dominic. I do. But we're in this together. You don't have to carry all of this on your own. He looked at her, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and frustration. I don't know if I can keep doing this. The pressure is too much. I feel like I'm failing at everything. The raw vulnerability in his words shook Nina. She had always known Dominic as the man who had everything under control. But now he seemed lost, just as lost as she had felt in the beginning. You're not failing, she said gently. You're human, Dominic. We both are. We've been through a lot, and we're both figuring this out. But we're in this together. And that means we can lean on each other. Not just when things are going well, but when they're falling apart too. The next morning, as Nina sat at her desk, she received a call from one of the investors they had been working with. The tension in the air was thick as she listened to the words on the other end of the line. The situation was worse than they thought. Dominic came in shortly after, his face grim. We need to make a decision, Nina. We either pull out now, or we risk everything. This could destroy us. The weight of the moment hung heavily between them. Everything they had worked for, everything they had fought for, was on the line. But Nina knew one thing. No matter what happened with the deal, they couldn't let it tear them apart. The days after their conversation were filled with tension. Nina and Dominic had made some headway in resolving the issues with the investors, but the pressure was taking its toll. The final decision on the merger loomed closer, and with it, the possibility of everything they had worked for, the company, their careers, and even their personal relationship collapsing. Dominic had been even more withdrawn than usual, and Nina couldn't help but notice the growing distance between them. He was consumed by the pressure, and she was left to pick up the pieces of their fragile partnership. Every conversation felt like a battle, every decision a struggle. The foundation they had started to build together seemed to be slipping away. One afternoon, as Nina sat at her desk, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Dominic. Meet me in my office. I need to talk. Nina felt a knot form in her stomach. His messages had been few and far between lately, and she knew that when he reached out like this, it was because something serious was on his mind. In Dominic's office, the air was thick with unspoken words. He was standing by the window, his hands in his pockets, looking out at the city skyline. When he turned to face her, his expression was grim, his usual confidence replaced by a weight that made her heart race. You look like you're carrying the world on your shoulders, Nina said softly, trying to break the ice. But the tension was impossible to ignore. Dominic gave her a brief, weary smile. I think we both are. He motioned for her to sit. We need to talk about the merger. And us. Nina felt her pulse quicken. The familiar knot in her stomach twisted tighter. She wasn't sure where this conversation would go, but she had a feeling it wasn't going to be easy. What about the merger? She asked cautiously, trying to keep the conversation professional. Dominic took a deep breath before sitting down across from her. We have a choice to make. The investors are pressing us to finalize the deal, but I'm not sure it's the right move. I feel like we're signing away everything we've built. If we push forward, the company could lose its integrity, and we could lose more than just money." Nina nodded, her mind racing. She understood the stakes. The deal could be the company's breakthrough, but it could also ruin everything they stood for. It wasn't just a business decision. It was a moral one. And Dominic's hesitation made it clear that he was struggling with more than just the financial implications. "We both know the risks," she said quietly, "but if we back out now, it might destroy the company. And I don't think either of us wants that." Dominic leaned back in his chair, looking defeated. "I don't know what I want anymore, Nina. I don't know what's worth fighting for. This company, our marriage, everything has become so tangled, and I'm not sure I know how to untangle it." The honesty in his words struck Nina like a physical blow. She could see how much he was hurting, and it made her own heart ache. She had always seen Dominic as the one who had it all together, but now she saw the cracks in the facade. "I can't pretend to know what you're going through," Nina said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "But I can tell you that I'm not going anywhere. Whatever happens with the company, we'll figure it out." Together, Dominic's eyes met hers, and for the first time in a long while, there was no mask, no barrier. It was just him, vulnerable and uncertain. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent my whole life keeping everything under control, and now I feel like I'm losing everything, including you." Nina's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected him to say that. She had been so focused on their professional struggles, but in that moment, she realized that the personal side of their relationship had become just as fragile. "You're not losing me," she said, her voice firm. "We're in this together, remember. No matter what happens with the company, we're not going to let this tear us apart." Dominic didn't respond immediately. He just sat there, looking at her as if he were trying to figure out if he could trust her words. Finally, he nodded, though his expression was still conflicted. Later that evening, Nina and Dominic sat down together in the living room, a rare moment of peace between them. The weight of the day still hung in the air, but they both knew that they had made a significant step forward. They weren't out of the woods yet, but at least they were starting to face their fears together. "I don't know what the future holds," Dominic said, his voice softer now, more reflective. "But I do know that I can't keep running from it. I have to face the truth about the company, about us." Nina reached over, taking his hand in hers. "And I'll be here, facing it with you, for the first time in what felt like a long time." Dominic looked at her with something other than the stress of the world on his shoulders. There was a glimmer of hope in his eyes, a sense of connection that hadn't been there before. The following days were a whirlwind. Dominic and Nina worked together to navigate the challenges they faced, both personally and professionally. They spent late nights discussing the future of the company, weighing their options carefully. The merger was still on the table, but they had started looking for alternative paths, ones that would allow them to maintain the integrity of their business while protecting what they had worked so hard to build. Their marriage, too, began to take a new shape. The cracks in their relationship hadn't healed, but they were no longer afraid to confront them. They spent more time together, not just in meetings, but in quiet moments where they could talk about their hopes, their fears, and what they wanted for the future. A week later, after much deliberation, they made a bold decision to reject the merger. It wasn't an easy choice, but it was one they made together. They knew it would be risky, but they also knew it was the right thing to do. The decision didn't come without consequences. There were repercussions for turning down the deal, and the financial strain on the company was palpable. But Nina and Dominic stood firm in their decision. They weren't just fighting for the company anymore. They were fighting for their future, their integrity, and their marriage. The aftermath of their decision to reject the merger was more difficult than Nina and Dominic had anticipated. The board members were disappointed, and the investors made it clear that they were no longer interested in working with the company. The backlash was swift and unrelenting. There were tense meetings, angry phone calls, and a palpable sense of anxiety hanging over the office. But as difficult as it was, there was something freeing about it. They had chosen integrity over profits, and though the consequences were severe, Nina couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in their decision. They had done what was right, even when it would have been easier to follow the money. One morning, as Nina walked into the office, she was greeted by a familiar face. It was Maggie, Dominic's longtime assistant, who had been with the company for years. Maggie had always been friendly to Nina, and though she didn't know her well, they'd exchanged pleasantries over the months. Today, though, there was something different in Maggie's demeanor. "Maggie, is everything all right?" Nina asked, noticing the worried look on her face. Maggie gave a small, nervous smile. "We need to talk. Dominic wants to see you in his office. It's about the merger fallout." Nina's stomach twisted. "Is he okay?" Maggie hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "He's been under a lot of pressure. Just take it easy on him, okay?" Nina's heart sank. She had known that Dominic was struggling, but this felt different. She quickly made her way to his office, her steps quickening as she approached the door. She knocked softly before entering. Dominic was sitting at his desk, his hands resting on top of a stack of paperwork, his expression drawn and tired. He looked up as she entered, his eyes heavy with the weight of the past few days. "You wanted to talk," Nina said, trying to keep her voice steady. Dominic nodded, his voice hoarse. "Yeah, come in." "Sit down." Nina pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her tone gentle, though she was anxious to hear what he had to say. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "Honestly, not great. We've lost a lot of support from the investors. Our stock is down, and the board is furious. I don't know what comes next." Nina watched him, seeing the exhaustion in his eyes. She could feel the weight of everything pressing down on him, and she knew he wasn't just upset about the company. There was something deeper, a fear of failure, of losing everything he had worked for, including her. "I'm sorry," Nina said quietly, "but I still think it was the right decision. We've saved ourselves from compromising our values. We can rebuild." Dominic's eyes flickered toward hers, and for a moment he was silent. "I don't know, Nina. I'm not sure if I can keep doing this. The company, the pressure. I'm trying to keep it together, but it feels like I'm losing control of everything. Maybe I'm just not cut out for this anymore." Nina's heart ached for him. She had never seen him this vulnerable, this unsure of himself. She had always seen him as the pillar of strength, the one who knew exactly what he was doing. But now she saw the cracks in his armor. "You were cut out for this," Nina said firmly, her voice steady. "You've built this company from the ground up, and we're going to rebuild it, too. It's just going to take time, and we'll do it together. I believe in you. I believe in us." Dominic looked at her, his expression softening. For a moment, She saw the man behind the CEO, the man who had been struggling just like her, the man who had been trying so hard to carry the weight of everything on his own. He looked at her as if he was seeing her for the first time. "I don't deserve you," he said, his voice low, filled with a mix of gratitude and guilt. Nina reached across the desk, placing her hand on his. "You don't have to be perfect. None of us are. But we're in this together. We'll make it through, even if we have to start over." Dominic squeezed her hand, the connection between them palpable. For the first time in weeks, he smiled, a real smile, though it was tinged with exhaustion. "You're right. We'll figure it out, together." The next few weeks were filled with long hours and tough decisions. But Nina and Dominic worked side by side, finding ways to cut costs, revamp their strategy, and regain the trust of their remaining clients. It was a slow process, but the more they worked together, the stronger their bond became. They were no longer just husband and wife, but true partners, united in their efforts to save the company and their future. Nina saw a side of Dominic she had never known before, not the cold, distant CEO, but the man who was capable of love and vulnerability, someone who was willing to admit his mistakes and work through them. One evening, after another long day at the office, Nina and Dominic sat together on the balcony of their penthouse. The city lights stretched out before them, the noise of the world muted by the calm of the night. They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of everything they had been through slowly lifting. "I think we're going to be okay," Nina said. Breaking the silence, Dominic turned to her, his gaze softening. "Yeah, I think we are. Thanks for believing in me." Nina smiled, her heart full. "I always will." For the first time since their marriage began, Nina felt at peace. The journey they had started on was far from over, but she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Not just as business partners, not just as a married couple, but as two people who had found a way to truly trust each other and love each other, despite all the obstacles. Months had passed since the moment they decided to take control of their fate. The company had slowly started to recover from the fallout of rejecting the merger. It wasn't easy, and there were still tough days ahead, but Nina and Dominic were stronger than ever. They had rebuilt their trust, their business, and their relationship, brick by brick. It was a rainy Thursday evening when Nina sat at her desk, staring at the updated financial reports. The numbers were looking better, much better. They had secured new clients, streamlined operations, and most importantly, they had regained their reputation in the market. There was still a long way to go, but they were heading in the right direction. She looked up when the door to her office opened. Dominic stood in the doorway, looking at her with an expression that was a mix of pride and exhaustion. "You look like you're about to drown in all this paperwork," he said, his voice playful, though his eyes held a deeper, more serious look. Nina chuckled, pushing a few stray strands of hair behind her ear. "It's the final stretch, but I think we're finally getting there. The company's back on track." Dominic stepped inside, sitting down next to her desk. "I know we've been through a lot these past months, but you've done an incredible job. I couldn't have asked for a better partner." Nina met his gaze, her heart swelling. "I couldn't have done it without you. We've both put everything into this, and it's working." For the first time in a long while, there was no tension between them, no unspoken words, no hidden fears, just a quiet understanding that they had come through the storm together and come out stronger for it. Later that evening, after the workday was done, Nina and Dominic walked through the city streets, hand in hand. The rain had stopped, leaving the air crisp and fresh. The lights of the city reflected off the wet pavement, casting a soft glow over everything. For the first time, everything felt right. "Do you remember when we first met?" Dominic asked, his voice soft as they walked side by side. "I never thought we'd be here. I thought I had everything under control, but I didn't realize how much I needed someone like you to balance everything out." Nina smiled, squeezing his hand. "I remember. I didn't think I'd be here either, but I'm glad I am." Dominic stopped walking and turned to face her, his eyes locking with hers. There was a quiet intensity in his gaze, one that made Nina's heart race. "You're everything I didn't know I needed," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I could do this on my own, but now, I can't imagine my life without you." Nina's breath caught in her throat. She had known from the beginning that their marriage wasn't typical, but now, standing here with him, she realized that everything had led to this moment. A moment where they were no longer just business partners or strangers forced into an arrangement. They were something more. "I feel the same," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never imagined I'd be here, but now that I am, I can't picture it any other way." Dominic stepped closer, reaching out to gently cup her face in his hands. "Nina," he said, his voice tender, "I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Not because we're married or because of the business, but because you're the person I've been looking for, even when I didn't know I was looking." Nina's heart swelled with emotion, her eyes filling with tears. "I want that too, Dominic. I don't need anything else as long as I have you." They stood there, in the middle of the quiet street, everything else fading away. It was just the two of them and the future they were about to create together. A year later, things were better than either of them had imagined. The company had recovered fully and even surpassed its former success. They had proven that it wasn't just about the money or the merger, but about their values, their vision, and their partnership. They had built something real, not just professionally, but personally. Their relationship had blossomed, evolving from a marriage of convenience into a deep and unwavering love. They had learned to lean on each other, to trust each other, and to fight for each other. Every challenge they faced, whether in business or in their personal lives, had only made them stronger. They were no longer the strangers who had entered into a marriage by chance. They were partners in every sense of the word. One evening, as they stood together on the balcony of their penthouse, looking out over the city they had come to love, Nina wrapped her arms around Dominic. Pulling him close, "We made it," she whispered, a smile on her face as she rested her head against his chest. "We made it," Dominic echoed, his voice full of pride and contentment. "And I'm never letting go." They stood there in the quiet, feeling the weight of everything they had overcome. The world was still full of challenges, but they had learned one thing: together they could handle anything.